Hello, everyone. Good day. Welcome to the first of a number of lectures for inflammation and repair. For this first lecture, we'll be talking about what inflammation is, um, how it manifests in the body, why is it important, what its role is in keeping the organism alive, what are the molecules and the cells that are involved in the process. Um, we'll also be comparing two different phases of inflammation, the acute and chronic phases, which are two very distinct pathologic entities. We'll also be describing in detail the first phase of acute inflammation, specifically how the blood vessels react, how the blood vessels behave when you have an inflammatory stimulus. And then, as part of that, we'll also be talking about a review of hemodynamic forces or the Starling forces, and we'll cap it off with an explanation of the different types of effusion. Now, whenever there's injury to the body, whether this is caused by infection, trauma, physical or chemical agents, or immunologic injury, this results in tissue damage. Okay? And by virtue of the damage to the tissues, the other cells in the body will try to respond. And it does so with the hopes of eliminating the effect of injury. Once the cause of was the cause or the inciting agent is removed, it will try to clean things up. It will try to remove the dead cells, the inflammatory cells, so that repair can begin. Now, this whole process actually describes a very important reaction in the body known as inflammation. Okay, and we basically define inflammation is the response of vascularized tissue to injury. Okay, it is a response of vascularized living tissue to injury. Okay, and I like to parse this definition to emphasize certain very specific key terms. First, it is a local response in that only the cells in close proximity to the organ of injury or the tissue of injury is affected. Number two, it affects vascular tissue. Okay, it affects vascular tissue or tissue with blood vessels only. Okay, and it is said to be a response to injury. Regardless of whatever caused the injury, um, the tissues respond the same way, whether it's caused by infection, physical and chemical injury, immunologic injury. The tissues react the same way, and the goal is to eliminate the cause of cell injury. Number one, so you remove what's causing the inflammation. Number two, you remove um, the effects of the injury. So you'll have to remove the cells and tissues that have died as a result of the original insult. And the end result is so that you can kickstart the process of healing and reconstitution of the damaged cells. So inflammation, as mentioned, is part of a broader protective response or innate immunity. As I mentioned, this goes back to the definition, regardless of whatever is causing the inflammation, um, the tissues respond the same way. Okay? Now, this is a very good thing. It's trying to control the injury. But can inflammation be harmful? And the quick answer to that is yes. Inflammation can induce harm through several means. Number one, um, it can occur when um, the degree of the inflammatory response is so great. Now, allergies are supposed to be good because it is the body trying to react to something that it recognizes as non-self or something that is foreign. However, when allergic reactions tend to become severe, the person develops shock, difficulty in breathing, and this is known as anaphylaxis or anaphylactic reaction. So, what starts off as a good response against substances that are foreign to the body becomes very severe, becomes very dangerous, and it goes out of hand. Certain conditions like autoimmune diseases cause inflammation by virtue that the body cannot react, cannot differentiate between what is foreign and what is self. In autoimmune diseases like rheumatoid arthritis, lupus erythematosus, Sjogren's syndrome, Hashimoto's disease, the body recognizes its own cells as being foreign. Okay? And then finally, um, you also have atherosclerosis, which is accumulation of fat in the blood vessels, in the walls of the blood vessels. And we know that lipids, when oxidized, can facilitate the release of reactive oxygen species, which can be inflammatory in nature. Now, inflammation again serves to terminate whatever is causing the injury, and it serves to make sure that the necrotic cells, the cells that are participating in the protective response, are um, broken down or dissipated or removed when the inflammatory process is no longer necessary. Okay, so because of that, it is important to realize that inflammation has to be counterbalanced by anti-inflammatory mechanisms. Okay, so quick notes version: inflammation is good except when it becomes excessive. Okay, and inflammation must be controlled. Once you no longer need the inflammatory response must be stopped because there will be collateral damage to the surrounding tissues. How does inflammation manifest in the body? So inflammation um, has cardinal signs. It has cardinal manifestations, and we'll talk about them in a bit. But whenever you hear the suffix itis, okay, like appendicitis, pleuritis, pericarditis, um, carditis, myocarditis, okay? So if you see the suffix itis, this usually indicates that there is inflammation to that particular organ, okay? So in inflammation, there are five cardinal signs. Tumor, rubor, calor, dolor, and functionaliza. Tumor is Latin for swelling. So the area swells, there is redness, there is heat, it is painful, and there is limitation of function. So those are the five cardinal signs of inflammation: tumor, rubor, calor, dolor, and functionaliza. Okay? And you will understand the reason why that is so, why these signs and symptoms manifest during inflammation later on during the discussion. Okay, as you can see here, you have a normal arm here on top, and the second arm is notably swollen, so this is an inflamed arm. Okay, so this is an example of rubor and tumor. Okay, now so in inflammation, basically there are a lot of players participating. Okay, the response can generally be divided into three. Okay, the first response is said to be vascular. The first response in inflammation is said to be vascular in nature. The main player is the blood vessel. Okay. After that, you also have a cellular component to the inflammatory process, and these include your leukocytes, whether they are neutrophils, eosinophils, basophils, lymphocytes, and monocytes. And you also have plasma proteins that are secreted by the different cells in the body. Okay? The extracellular matrix, or the tissue surrounding the different cells, will also play a part in the inflammation and repair process. Okay? Now, inflammation, um, I mentioned earlier that inflammation is mediated by chemical substances, and these chemical substances are generally known as chemical mediators. These chemical mediators come from your WBCs. They also come from the endothelium, or the lining of the blood vessels, and they also come from specialized cells known as mast cells. Okay? Now, the outcome of acute inflammation is either the body successfully gets rid of it, and this is known as resolution, or the body cannot get rid of it, and this results in chronic inflammation. Okay? So in acute inflammation, duhara na siya. It's either maayo ka, there is repair, there is resolution of the inflammatory process, or the body cannot control it, and the injury persists, and this is known as chronic inflammation. Okay? As mentioned, inflammation can be acute or chronic. Now, acute inflammation is the first response. Okay, it is the first response. It usually occurs in the first 48 hours of injury, and the mechanism here is first, it's vascular. The first response would be blood vessels, and then the second will be cellular. And the major player of the cellular component of acute inflammation are the neutrophils. Okay. Now, what are the steps of the inflammatory response? You have the 5 R's. First, the body has to identify the injurious agent, and once ma-recognize na niya, the body will have to call in the WBCs. The WBCs will do their work to remove the agent, so mamatay na siya, but then again, the body has to find a way to regulate the process. You don't want to have the inflammatory process continue because kung wala na ang organism or wala na ang injurious agent, you don't want the tissues to be collateral damage. Okay? So once na-regulate na niya, there is going to be resolution or of the entire inflammatory process. Okay? So we'll talk about this later because this is actually a picture of how the neutrophils migrate to the site of injury, but we'll be talking about this in greater detail later. Now, this is actually a picture or a photomicrograph of an inflamed appendix. Okay, so you can see that you have a lot of neutrophils. You have multiple lobated WBCs in the wall of the appendix. And as mentioned, we use the suffix itis to denote that there is acute inflammation. So this is acute appendicitis. Now, let's talk about how the blood vessels react. Now, essentially, um, the events of acute inflammation is divided into two. Okay, you have the blood vessels and you have the cellular component. Okay, blood vessels and the cellular component. Ang una gyud na niya would be the blood vessels. Okay, now, so, as mentioned, there are two phases in acute inflammation. Number one is the vascular phase. Number two is the cellular phase. Let's focus for now on the vascular phase because we have to understand what happens in the blood vessels so that we will have an idea why we will manifest with the cardinal manifestations of inflammation. Okay, so the picture here shows two capillary beds. Okay, now imagine lang nato blood vessels sila. Now, let's use as an example infection as the inciting agent of inflammation. Okay? Now, the cell walls of um, the cell walls of an organism or a bacteria will actually have um, molecular patterns or a sequence of carbohydrates that will be detected by the body. This sequence of carbohydrates are known as PAMPs, pathogen-associated molecular patterns. Okay, PAMPs. So, naasiya sa cell wall sa organism. It could be different types of sugars or proteins, but generally, we lump them all together as PAMPs. PAMPs are sequences of molecules that are detected by the body. Okay? Pathogen-associated molecular patterns. Now, PAMPs are recognized by certain receptors within the body, and this is found in the endothelium, in the blood, called TLRs, toll-like receptors. Toll-like receptors. Now, once we have interaction between the PAMPs and the TLRs, the cells, the endothelium, and other WBCs in the blood will secrete cytokines. And the mother cytokine is TNF, tumor necrosis factor. TNF will then produce interleukin 1 and interleukin 6. So TNF is said to be the mother cytokine, and so once you have TNF, this will facilitate a cascade of increased production of interleukin 1 and interleukin 6. Okay? So, mauna si tulo sige magpuyo. TNF, interleukin 1, interleukin 6. Now, TNF and interleukin 1 will facilitate the dilation of the blood vessels. Will dilate ang blood vessels. And the reason why blood vessels will dilate is because you would want to have more blood to the affected area. Okay? You would want to have more blood in the affected area because you would want to have more inflammatory cells. Dadgunin mo ang inflammatory cells dito sa area. So, liguan mo si og dugo. The blood vessels in the area that is inflamed will become engorged. Now, if you have a hose, diba? If you imagine yun na kay hose, if you increase the caliber of the hose, but the pressure of the water inside remains the same, what's going to happen is that muhinay ang dagan sa area. Diba? So what's going to happen is similar in the blood vessels. You will increase blood flow in the area by vasodilation. Nidako ang caliber sa blood vessel nimo, so mas daghan og dugo. Since mas daghan ang dugo, mupuwa siya sa area. That's why if you scratch the area, ma-inflame ang area, mupuwa siya because this is a localized response to the stimulus. And that is brought about by dilation of your blood vessels. Mupuwa siya because there's more blood. Okay? That is known as rubor. There is heat. Slightly warm ang area na inflamed because there is more blood to the area. There is dissipation of heat brought about by increased amounts of blood in the area. That's calor. Okay? And then, of course, the associated inflammation will cause pain due to the secretion of cytokines, and this is known as dolor. Okay, now, so first event nato sa vascular event is vasodilation. Okay? So that's causes rubor, calor, and dolor. Now, so again, ang purpose nato diri is I'm trying to show you na the vessel is reacting and it does that by dilation. Okay? That is the first vascular event. But let's go into the specifics. Okay? Let's go into the specifics. Now, before mag-vasodilate, actually what happens is there is a transient vasoconstriction. Mugamay siya, pero it is very transient. Mo-dilate dayon. So the first response is vasoconstriction, then mag-dilate dayon. Okay? Pero since kadyot ra ang vasoconstriction, ang mas prominent na mugawas is yung vasodilation. Okay? Since nag-dilate imong blood vessels, you're bringing more blood to the area, but at the same time, nihinay. Kay nidako man ang caliber sa imuhang vessel. So, at the same time, na mas daghan og blood na nagahinay ang flow niya, so matenga ang dugo sa area. That's why there is redness, there is heat. And because natenga siya, kay nag-slow down ang circulation brought about by the vasodilation, this is known as stasis. So, maong mupuwa, maong muburot. Okay? Now, after vasodilation, okay, what's going to happen is there is going to have increased vascular permeability. There's going to be increased vascular permeability. So, at this point, daghan nagdugo per cross-section of the tissue. Okay? Now, what's going to happen next is that there is going to be leakage of the fluid compartment of the blood. Okay? And that is called plasma. Now, we know that the lining of the endothelium is lined by simple squamous epithelium. Okay? Now, if naakay inflammatory reaction, dili lang mo dilate ang imuhang blood vessel. At the same time, mo shrink or mo contract ang endothelial lining of your blood vessels. Okay? So, mo contract ang individual simple squamous epithelium. So, as a result, magbuslot-buslot na ay spaces between the simple squamous epithelium. And as a result, makagawas ang tubig, makagawas ang plasma. Okay? Now, this is the normal blood vessel. Okay? So let's focus on the top picture. Okay? Now, this is actually a review of the hemodynamic forces. I think you are familiar with this sa physiology. So we have a blood vessel lined by endothelium, and you have blood and plasma here, and you have plasma proteins within the plasma as well. Now, ang pressure nimo, ang dugo nimo will exert pressure on the walls of the blood vessel. Okay? Ang imuhang dugo will exert pressure on the walls of the vessel. Think of it as let's say there are 100 people in a small room. You're trying to cram 100 students in a small room. Naghuot mo sa tunga, pero ang katong naa sa kilid sa room, will get pushed to the walls. Okay? Ang pag-push sa mga students na naa sa gilid against the wall can be akin to what is known as hydrostatic pressure or blood pressure. Essentially, this is the pressure exerted by blood on the vessel wall. Okay? And ang direction niya is pagawas gid siya. Okay? Pagawas gid siya. But there is also a pressure that is being exerted inwards, and that is brought about by plasma proteins. Proteins bring in water, mohold siya og water. Okay? So by virtue of that, plasma proteins actually try to hold the water in within the blood vessels. And the most important protein that is responsible for that is albumin, which is the most abundant plasma protein in the blood. Now, what happens? So essentially, you have two counteracting forces: hydrostatic pressure na pagawas o colloidal osmotic pressure pasulod, which is exerted by albumin. Now, if there are aberrations, okay, this will aberrations in the fluid. Ang may tabuan is there's going to be leakage of fluid outside. And leakage of fluid outside is said to be called as edema. Okay? Fluid nigawas sa blood vessels papunta sa tissues. Okay? So essentially, that is edema. Now, edema can be transudative or exudative. Okay? Edema can be transudative or exudative. Now, let's go back to this illustration. Now, ang transudate is brought about when there is increased hydrostatic pressure. Okay? Increased hydrostatic pressure. So when does that happen? Kung magpundo ang dugo. Kung magpundo ang dugo, fluid will back up. Kaya kapundo man sila. So, mas daghag fluid per surface area of the blood vessel, mo increase ang hydrostatic pressure. So, ang hitabo, mag-push sila against the blood vessel walls, the fluid is going to leak regardless. So, as a result, ang mugawas na fluid is similar in component or similar in composition sa plasma nimo. Kaya nilusot raman siya. Okay, so that is known as a transudate. Now, if the fluid, if the leakage of the fluid is brought about by nabuslot ang spaces or ni-increase yung contraction due to inflammation, so ang mahitabo, it's not just fluid that's leaking out, but the molecules inside the blood vessel, in which case it is known as exudate. Okay? So expected, ang transudate should have a low specific gravity that is more or less equal to plasma. Exudate, mas taas yung specific gravity kaya nanglusot man ang cells and proteins. Okay? So these are our take-home messages for this lecture. Number 1, inflammation is a localized response of tissues with blood vessels. Second, it can be acute or chronic. Kung acute siya, you have a vascular phase, you have a cellular phase. Okay? Kung sa vascular event, first event mo is transient vasoconstriction, and then vasodilation, and then increased vascular permeability. And that's it for this part. I hope you were able to get most of the concepts. If not, please go back to review and try to make your own tables. All right? Thank you very much.